the citizens of this state is about to become a bigger topic of conversation. I'm hopeful that the KCC's final ruling on our protest will be of interest to those considering the proposed legislation. In January 2017, John Wilson proposed House Bill 2189. It has two primary objectives. One, the KCC should require proof that any oil and gas lease is valid before granting any approvals for drilling wells. And two, the KCC to not allow any wells to be drilled within 500 feet of anything requiring a permit. So a water well, a home, a barn, a pond, a business, these are all things that we have to get permits to build. Our group of neighbors are so very thankful to Representative Tom Sloan, the chairman of the Water and Environment Committee, who held the hearing last spring for this bill. Bill? Sorry. Bill, it was Bill. Our testimony opened some eyes to the lack of property right protections as it relates to oil activity in Kansas. They were very empathetic and truly astonished at some of what we told them. One of the members even stated, this is not how the oil and gas industry in Kansas is supposed to treat people. The committee has since then charged the KCC with the task of reviewing their existing regulations to see what modifications can be made to address the items that are in House Bill 2189. The KCC meeting is scheduled to review those recommendations in Wichita on December 4th. Certainly having House Bill 2189 as the law of the land is preferred, but looking to the KCC, since they do hold the power to protect us, to include these provisions for surface owners is a good place to start. All we want is to protect our homes, where we live and work, and where we raise our families. As I've said all along, the oil industry gains should not constitute my losses. Thank you.
All right, if you have questions for Amy and Scott, please write them on your cards and write Amy or Scott in the upper right-hand corner, and one of the people on the left. Our next speaker is Gil Szymanski. Gil Szymanski holds a PhD in engineering, is a registered geologist in Kansas, is certified by the Association of Groundwater Scientists and Engineers as a groundwater professional, and is registered as a professional groundwater hydrologist by the American Institute of Hydrology. He has over 40 years of professional earth and environmental sciences experience, including about 5 years during which he consulted for regional government in New Zealand on issues related to hydraulic fracturing and deep well injection. So please welcome Gil.
Thank you. I think as many of you know, in October, the Mid-States Energy Company, a company from Fort Myers, Florida, put in an application to drill injection wells on 2 leases. And those applications were public noticed by the KCC. These are the Hadel lease, which is down on section 36, southwest of Eudora, and the Thrasher lease, which is across the highway from that in section 25. These wells, of note, have already been drilled, so they must be very confident of getting their application approved. This shows you the sections in a part of Douglas County. Section 35 is south of Highway 458, and section 26 is north of it. And this is Highway 1057 coming down from west of Eudora. So that's where these are located. And this is another map that has been prepared, which shows you where at least some of the existing or inactive wells have been drilled in Douglas County of this kind in the recent past. It doesn't show, this will be the area where these two wells will be. So it gives you an idea that there's quite a few wells going in Douglas County, and they're all pretty much lining up on a north-south line in that direction. A little bit about the geology. Don't know too much about it other than the well logs that were submitted with the applications for one well on each property. On the Hadel lease, the well's set to a depth of 828 feet below ground, and it's perforated from 750 to 760 feet, a 10-foot section. But 5 feet of that section is shale, 2 feet of it is sandy shale, and 3 feet of it is classified by the driller as oil sands. Presumably that's where the oil is. But what you see there is that out of that 10-foot section that they intend to inject in, only a relatively small portion of it is very conductive that would be able to take the injection fluid. And on the Thrasher lease is a similar kind of thing. The well's set to about the same depth, 830 feet, perforated from 720 to 730 feet. But of that 10-foot perforated interval, 7 feet was classified by the driller as broken sand with anywhere from 60 to 80% shale. Broken sand is sort of a new term for me. I haven't never seen it on a drilling log before. So again, only a relatively small portion of that stream would be permeable enough to take injected fluids. This is just an idea of the general concerns that come with injection wells, the potential for contaminating freshwater aquifers. In this case, based on the one well log we've seen on each property, that's not likely on the immediate vicinity of the wells themselves because the overlying material is alternating layers of shale and limestone, pretty impermeable stuff generally. If they get a good seal on that, that would be to their benefit and help that from coming up the well casing. But we don't have good hydrogeologic information for the region as a whole or the area around that lease. One well well log is pretty thin evidence to go by. Geologic conditions can change in short distances. And judging by the letters of concern that have been registered so far on the record, there's at least some people in the area that do have water supply wells. I'd like to get more information about those wells, where they're located and where the productive layer is. Another concern is land subsidence in Kansas. This is generally related to dissolution of salt, kind of things you see down in places like Hutchinson. There are some pretty remarkable cases of land subsidence there, and where large dissolution holes are formed, kind of thing that you see in Florida, where they have dissolution of limestone and places where cars can be gobbled up by the terrain. The well logs in this case don't indicate any potential for salt dissolution, so that shouldn't be a factor. The third one is induced earthquakes. We've known about induced earthquakes from human activities at least since 1970, when the government was trying to inject hazardous waste in the Denver area and found out that they were inducing earthquakes there from it. So they had to stop their injection at that point. Anytime you're injecting fluids, that's a potential problem. earthquake potential, when you want to try and figure out what the potential is for having an earthquake somewhere, well, earthquakes are, as everybody knows, is the ground shaking by a sudden slip of a fault. So you have to have a fault to have an earthquake, pretty much. But there's a rider on that, because faults can form pretty quickly where there might not have been a fault before. And we have a little bit of a problem with identifying where existing faults are. A lot of time we don't know there's a fault somewhere until it self-identifies by an earthquake. Most faults in the world are located around plate boundaries. There's quite a few. Everybody's familiar, I think, with San Andreas Fault in California. It's a plate boundary between the Pacific and the North American plates. I spent about 9 years in New Zealand. I don't know if anybody here has heard about the Christchurch earthquake, but before that happened, Christchurch was considered a very low probability earthquake area. Nobody knew of any faults close to Christchurch. Those faults self-identified with a magnitude 6 and 7 earthquakes that occurred back in 2010 and 2011. In the later earthquake in February 2011, over 300 people died. Earthquake risk is evaluated using a combination of seismic history, which is sometimes referred to as a real source, historic records of where earthquakes occurred and what their magnitude was, and data on geologic structure, which includes specifically or particularly faults. In Douglas County, we don't have a whole lot of relevant information on geologic maps. There's a geologic map, I think it was put out about 1992 for Douglas County. Known faults are on there, but there's only one known fault in Douglas County, and that's the Orden Fault down west of Baldwin. That's about 10 miles southwest of these leases in Eudora. And the other thing that's relevant is seismic history. This is the geologic map in the vicinity of the Handle and Thrasher leases. Those leases are on these two sections here. So you're looking at sections a couple of miles around that. There's no faults that are pictured there. But that doesn't mean there aren't any faults there, unfortunately. This is the Warden Fault. That's how a fault is often pictured, sometimes with more information, but just to the west of Baldwin City. This is another geologic map, and it has a better idea of where some faults are, at least in the general area, but I would say that where we are up here in northeast Kansas, they don't have a very good idea of where the faults are actually located. But what this indicates, this line here would indicate a potential fault or some type of geologic structure that is very pertinent, since it ends up about where these leases are. Sometimes it did not identify on this particular geologic map what that was. Sometimes those might be lines for anticlines or synclines. Those are geologic features where the earth crust is folded, and they're generally very indicative. There are usually faults associated with those. This is a map of Kansas showing some of the major geologic features. This is the central Kansas uplift and the Nemaha Ridge. Those themselves are not faults, but there are a number of faults associated with them. And those black dots indicate where earthquakes have been found and reported in the past. These more recent ones down here for 2013 and 2014 are all pretty much known to be induced earthquakes. Probably quite a few of these others are, because they're all in areas of oil development, pretty much. And these two little historic ones over here are Douglas County, fairly close to the part of Douglas County near Lawrence. This gives you another impression of where the earthquakes have been reported in Kansas in the past. The colors are not, the historic ones are the gray ones, but they're sort of get meshed in with the blue ones, which are the most recent ones. But you can see that there are at least 3 historic ones in Douglas County, and then more recent ones. There's at least 2 recent ones that are close to Lawrence. 2 of the historic ones are very close to Lawrence. You might be able to notice that these ones here are sort of on a line going to the north-northwest from down about Lynn and Bourbon County boundary. And this one here, from Kansas City to Wamego, is also sort of on a line. So where those 2 line intersects is pretty close to Lawrence and Douglas County. And what I would say as a geologist is they probably indicate some structure down there that is conducive to earthquakes of one kind or another. So it would not be unexpected that in some time in the future there might be earthquakes or additional earthquakes along those lines. Some of them in the past have been pretty big. We didn't have seismic measuring equipment back in the 1800s, but in 1867 there was a major earthquake in Wamego that affected Lawrence to the extent that buildings were damaged and people ran out into the streets. Later on there was a major earthquake, I think it was in the 30s in Kansas City. That was also felt in Lawrence. The one in Wamego was felt in a pretty large area. There have been on the order of 4 or 5 that were large enough over the last, since the one in Wamego, that they were felt in the 1906 or so, in the 1930s. So on the short term, before we started getting all these induced earthquakes from, particularly from drilling down there in Oklahoma, we used to think about this part of the country as being fairly inactive from an earthquake standpoint. But if you take a closer look and look at what's happening now, it doesn't seem as inactive as we used to think as geologists. Part of the problem in terms of recording earthquakes in Kansas is that we have no permanent recording equipment. We don't have any seismic equipment. New Zealand's a fairly geologically active place. They have a national seismic monitoring system with seismic equipment in all parts of the country. We don't have, New Zealand itself, landmass-wise, is about the size of Kansas. We don't have any here that are permanent stations in Kansas. Some of this data comes from a short-term network that was set up in the 1980s to measure small earthquakes to see how many were happening. The ones from that are some of these smaller dots. As I've already said, earthquake-induced seismicity is a relatively new phenomenon. It comes from various things, but the primary thing it's associated with is injection wells. You do get earthquakes from fracking, but they're very low magnitude earthquakes. Hydraulic fracturing can produce earthquakes in the 1, 2 to potentially in about 3 magnitude on the Richter scale. Induced earthquakes that we've had in recent times get up to the 5 to 6 magnitude. Most of them are probably less than that, as you can see on the size of those circles that indicating where they occur. But there's a fairly high collection of them in some places. are highly evident in Oklahoma and in southwest Kansas from Oklahoma. Both saltwater injection wells and enhanced oil recovery wells can cause earthquakes, although the saltwater injection wells have a higher probability of causing earthquakes. And quoting from the U.S. Geological Survey, they're the preeminent geological agency basically in the world. Induced seismicity can occur at significant distances from injection wells and at different depths. At distances 10 miles or more away from the injection point and at significantly greater depths than the injection point. Besides the things that I've talked about in terms of the seismic history and the location of geologic structure, other factors that are pertinent to whether or not an earthquake may occur from an injection well are the geologic and hydrogeologic settings. And for evaluating the current case in Eudora, we would need to have more information than just the one hole we have currently on each site. It'd be good to have more information in the general area, going radially out from the two leased properties to be able to make any kind of decision about the potential impact to water resources like freshwater aquifers and the potential for induced earthquakes. That's all I have.
If you have questions for Amy and Scott and neighbors or Gil, please, let's see, Candace, stand up. She's going to come start collecting some of those if you have them. We had Gil kind of talk about here, close to Lawrence, there, a little ways down the street to Baldwin, and the last signifier is everywhere. And our last speaker is going to talk, hails from Chase County, and she's kind of representing the everywhere. Alexa Dawson hails from Chase County. She's a mother, a musician, and part of the musical group The Skirt. Alexa is part Potawatomi and part Cherokee and is involved in the indigenous movement toward a new economy apart from fossil